The shadow in the attic. When Emily and I first stumbled across the old colonial house on Maple Street, it felt like fate. We had been looking for a place to call our own for months, and this house seemed perfect. It was charmingly weathered, with creaky floors and ivy climbing the brick walls. Sure, it needed a little work, but that was part of the appeal. We wanted a project, something to build together. The realtor gave us the usual spiel about the house's history. Built in the early 1900s, it had passed through a handful of owners before sitting empty for nearly a decade. She didn't mention why it had remained unsold for so long, and I didn't think to ask. Emily, always practical, made sure we got it inspected thoroughly before signing the papers. The inspector's only concerns were superficial: peeling paint, a few loose shingles, and the fact that one door on the second floor was inexplicably locked. Probably just an old storage closet, the inspector had said, shrugging. If you want, you can get a locksmith to open it after you've moved in. Emily and I were too excited to care about a locked door. We'd deal with it later. The rest of the house was more than enough to keep us busy. Our first night there was magical in that newlywed, everything is an adventure kind of way. We ordered pizza, drank cheap wine out of plastic cups, and laughed at how loud our footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. By midnight, we were lying on a mattress in the living room, too exhausted to haul it upstairs, whispering plans for paint colors and furniture arrangements. But something felt off. It started small. The air in the house seemed heavier than I expected. There was a faint, musty smell that no amount of open windows could chase away. And as we lay there in the dark, I thought I heard faint creaks coming from the second floor. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old homes make noise. That's what I told myself, anyway. Emily must have heard it too. "Do you think someone's upstairs?" she whispered. "It's just the house," I said, trying to sound confident. "Go to sleep." But sleep didn't come easily that night. And when it did, my dreams were restless. I dreamed of shadows slipping through the halls, their movements too smooth and deliberate to be the flicker of tree branches outside. The locked door became a source of fascination for us. By our second week in the house, curiosity got the better of me. I borrowed a set of lockpicking tools from a buddy at work, figuring I'd try my hand at getting it open. Emily rolled her eyes at me but stayed to watch. "What if there's a pile of cash in there?" I joked as I fiddled with the lock. "Or a priceless artifact." "Or a dead body," she shot back, smirking. The lock gave way with a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading up to the attic. The air that wafted down was colder than I expected, carrying with it the smell of mildew and something else. Something metallic, like rusted iron. We grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs. The attic was surprisingly large, its pitched roof forming an angular cathedral of cobwebbed beams. Most of it was empty, but in one corner stood a small table with a scattering of objects on top. As Emily held the flashlight, I stepped closer to examine them. The artifacts were strange. There was an old brass key, its surface tarnished and pitted. A child's wooden spinning top, carved with what looked like tiny runes. And a leather-bound journal, its cover stained with watermarks. "This is weird," Emily said, her voice uneasy. I flipped open the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was neat, the kind of meticulous penmanship you don't see much anymore. The entries were dated from the late 1950s. I skimmed the first few pages, which seemed to detail the mundane life of someone named Harold Whitaker, the house's previous owner. But as I read further, the tone shifted. "The shadow came again last night," one entry began. "I saw it standing at the foot of my bed. It doesn't move, but I can feel it watching me. I've started sleeping with the lamp on, but even the light doesn't seem to bother it. I don't know what it wants." Another entry read, "I thought I was going mad until I saw it during the day. It was in the kitchen, standing in the corner. It's not a trick of the light. It's real. God help me, it's real. I felt a chill run down my spine. Emily must have seen the look on my face because she grabbed the journal from me. She flipped through it, skimming the pages, her brow furrowed. This guy was definitely unhinged, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. He probably just imagined it. Maybe, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, I dreamed again of shadows. But this time, it didn't feel like a dream. I woke with a start, my heart racing, and turned to find Emily lying next to me, her back to me. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I scanned the room, my eyes straining against the darkness. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the far corner, just beyond the reach of the streetlight filtering through the blinds. It was tall and motionless, its outline blurry and indistinct, as if it were made of smoke. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I told myself it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe I had dreamed it after all. But when Emily came downstairs for breakfast, her face was pale, her eyes ringed with dark circles. I had the worst dream last night, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. I dreamed there was someone in the room with us. I tried to wake you up, but I couldn't move. My stomach dropped. Was it a shadow? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She froze, the coffee pot halfway to the counter. Her eyes met mine, wide and fearful. How did you know? The journal became an obsession. I read it cover to cover, searching for answers. Harold Whittaker's encounters with the shadow had grown more frequent over time, and his mental state had deteriorated as a result. The last few entries were barely coherent, filled with frantic scribbles and desperate pleas for help. The final entry simply read, "It's in me. I can't escape it. God forgive me." We started seeing the shadow more often. It would appear in the hallway, in the kitchen, even in the backyard. It never moved, but its presence was suffocating. We tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but that only seemed to make things worse. One night, Emily woke me up, shaking me violently. "It's in the room," she hissed. "I can feel it." I turned on the bedside lamp, but the shadow remained, standing at the foot of the bed. The light didn't dispel it, if anything, it made it clearer. It had no face, no features, just a dark, roiling mass. And yet, I could feel its gaze boring into me. We slept with the lights on after that, but it didn't help. The shadow was always there, lurking just out of reach, waiting. It began to invade our dreams, its presence seeping into our minds even when we thought we were safe. We couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. And then, one night, it spoke. The sound wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a feeling, a low hum that resonated in my skull, forming words without sound. "You let me in," it said. I don't remember finishing the sentence. Maybe it didn't need to. The words, or rather, the sensation of the words, rattled in my skull long after the shadow vanished. Emily and I sat in silence for hours, the bedside lamp flickering above us, as if even its feeble light strained to keep the dark at bay. By morning, we knew we couldn't stay in the house. The shadow was a predator, and we were its prey. Emily packed hurriedly while I made phone calls to find a hotel. But as I shoved a pile of clothes into a suitcase, a thought struck me. Would it follow us? Harold Whittaker's final journal entry echoed in my mind, "It's in me." What if the shadow had already bound itself to us? Or worse, what if leaving would somehow make it stronger? I shoved the thought aside and focused on getting out. Survival came first, answers could wait. We checked into a motel across town, its beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights a strange comfort after the suffocating gloom of the house. That night, for the first time in weeks, we slept. No dreams. No shadows. Just an empty, blissful nothingness. When we returned to the house the next morning to grab more belongings, the air felt different. It was as if the house itself knew we'd tried to escape. The smell of mildew had deepened, mingling with the acrid tang of something burning. The walls seemed darker, the corners sharper, as if the shadow had seeped into the very bones of the structure. That's when we heard it. A faint scratching noise, coming from the attic. "It's just a rat," I said, though my voice betrayed me. Emily shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We have to see," she said. I didn't argue. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, or maybe some grim compulsion, but I found myself climbing the attic stairs again, flashlight in hand. Emily followed close behind, her breathing shallow. At first, the attic seemed just as we'd left it. The table, the strange artifacts, the journal. But then the flashlight beam caught something new. Scratched into the wooden floorboards, in jagged letters that looked more like claw marks than handwriting, were the words. "Leave me alone." Emily gasped. I crouched to inspect the marks, running my fingers over the grooves. They were deep, impossibly so, as if carved by something far stronger than human hands. The air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, resonating from the walls themselves. Emily grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind us. But as we reached the first floor, the growling followed us. It wasn't coming from the attic anymore. It was everywhere. Desperation drove us back to the journal. I flipped through its pages, searching for anything we might have missed. That's when Emily pointed to a passage I hadn't noticed before. "The key is the only thing keeping it at bay. Without it, I am lost. It's not the house it wants. It's me." The key. My mind raced back to the brass key we'd found in the attic. It was still there, lying on the table among the other artifacts. Whatever connection the key had to the shadow, Harold had believed it was important. But why? "We have to go back up," I said. Emily's eyes widened. "Are you insane?" "The key might be the answer," I insisted. "We can't just leave it here. If Harold thought it was important, maybe it's our only chance." Reluctantly, she agreed. We armed ourselves with the only weapons we could think of, a kitchen knife for her, a baseball bat for me. Then, together, we ascended the stairs one final time. The attic was different now. The shadows were thicker, writhing like living things. The growling had subsided, replaced by a deafening silence. The key lay where we'd left it, glinting faintly in the dim light. I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the attic door slammed shut behind us. Emily screamed, and the shadows surged forward. The key burned in my hand, the metal searing into my palm. I screamed, but I didn't let go. The shadows circled us, their forms shifting and coalescing into something almost humanoid. 2 glowing pinpricks of red light appeared where its eyes should have been. "You let me in," it said again, the words vibrating through the air. "What do you want?" I shouted. My voice sounded small, pathetic. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it lunged. Emily swung the knife, but it passed through the creature as if it were smoke. I raised the key, instinct taking over, and thrust it toward the shadow. The effect was immediate. The creature recoiled, its form dissolving into a swirling mass. The growling returned, louder this time, a guttural roar that made my ears bleed. The attic seemed to collapse inward, the walls bending and warping around us. But the key held firm, its light growing brighter as the shadow shrank away. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We fled the house that night, leaving behind everything but the clothes on our backs. The key came with us, wrapped in a handkerchief and shoved into the glove compartment of the car. We never went back. I don't know what happened to the house. For all I know, it's still there, waiting for its next victims. But the shadow hasn't followed us, at least, not yet. Sometimes, I catch Emily staring at the key, her expression unreadable. I've thought about getting rid of it, throwing it into a river or burying it somewhere no one will ever find it. But every time I try, something stops me. Because deep down, I know the truth. The shadow isn't gone. It's waiting. And one day, it will come back. When it does, I'll be ready. A month passed before the nightmares began again. At first, they were fleeting glimpses of darkness, an indistinct, smothering blackness pressing against my subconscious. But as the days wore on, they grew more vivid. The shadow didn't just lurk anymore, it spoke. In the dreams, it didn't use words. Instead, it conveyed emotions, waves of terror, hatred, and hunger so raw they left me gasping for air when I woke. Emily had her own dreams. She wouldn't talk about them, but the bags under her eyes told me they were worse than mine. Then came the static. One evening, as we sat in our tiny apartment trying to distract ourselves with reruns of old sitcoms, the TV screen flickered. For a moment, the image dissolved into static, accompanied by a faint whispering sound. It was so brief I almost dismissed it. But then it happened again. And again. The static grew louder over the next few days, not just on the TV but on every electronic device in the apartment. Radios crackled to life with garbled, otherworldly murmurs. The glow of our phones became dimmer, their screens freezing on strange, distorted images. The whispers grew clearer. "Find it," they said. "Find it or let me in." The key became our obsession. Emily was the first to suggest it. "What if it's not just keeping it at bay," she said one night, holding the brass object like it might bite her. "What if it's calling it?" Her words sent a chill through me, but they made a horrible kind of sense. The shadow's whispers were growing more insistent, and the dreams had begun to overlap with reality. Objects in the apartment would move on their own. Lights flickered even when unplugged. The air itself felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in. The key pulsed faintly in my pocket, almost as if alive. "We need to destroy it," I said. "But how?" The metal felt unbreakable, impervious to tools or fire. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to destroy it. Some part of me felt tied to it, drawn to it, even. Emily and I pored over Harold Whittaker's journal again, searching for any mention of the key's origins. There, buried in one of the earlier entries, we found it. The key was forged to seal the rift, but it can also open it. The choice is mine. A rift. The words made my stomach churn. If the shadow had come through some kind of tear in reality, then the key was more than a lock, it was a weapon. But who had forged it? And what exactly had Harold meant by choice? The journal offered no more answers, but it did provide a clue, the name of a place. Blackwood Asylum. The asylum was long abandoned, a hulking relic of another era. Its windows gaped like empty sockets, and ivy crept over its crumbling facade. We drove there at dawn, the key wrapped tightly in cloth and buried at the bottom of my bag. Neither of us spoke during the drive. Words felt futile. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air turned icy. Shadows clung to the corners of the asylum's halls, and the faint sound of static hummed through the walls. The building was alive with something, not the shadow itself, but its residue, like an afterimage burned into the fabric of the place. In the basement, we found it, a door, marked with strange, angular symbols that matched the ones on the key. As we approached, the whispers rose to a crescendo. "Open it," the shadow's voice commanded, unmistakable now. "Or let me in." Emily hesitated, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What if this is what it wants?" she whispered. I didn't answer. My hand was already on the key. The key burned in my palm as I slid it into the jagged lock. It fit too perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Emily's voice was a faint echo behind me, pleading with me to stop, but her words were drowned out by the shadow's whispers. They filled my mind, urging, coaxing, promising. "Just turn it," it purred. "Let me through." I hesitated, my hand trembling on the brass handle. This door wasn't like the one in the attic. This one wasn't made by human hands. The symbols carved into it seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing as if alive. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath us, growing louder with each passing second. "Mark, please," Emily begged, pulling at my sleeve. "We don't know what's behind there." "But what if we do?" I snapped, my voice shaking. "What if this is the only way to end it?" Her grip loosened, her face a mask of fear and despair. I turned back to the door, closed my eyes, and twisted the key. The sound that followed wasn't something I could describe. It wasn't a click or a creak or even a roar. It was like the universe itself exhaled, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the walls and sent a wave of icy air rushing past us. The door swung inward, revealing not a room but a void, a swirling mass of darkness, shot through with streaks of sickly green light. It seemed to stretch forever, both vast and impossibly close, as if space itself had folded inward. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, barely distinguishable from the swirling void. But as it moved closer, it became more defined, tall, impossibly thin, and shifting constantly, as if its body was made of smoke and glass. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were twin pinpricks of crimson light, burning with an intelligence that was utterly alien. This wasn't the shadow. This was something worse. "Thank you," it said, though its voice didn't come from its mouth. It resonated inside my skull, 100 voices speaking as one. "You freed me!" Emily screamed, yanking me backward. The void pulsed, and the creature stepped through. The air grew heavier, pressing down on us with a suffocating weight. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to my knees. "Close it!" Emily shouted, shoving the key back into my hand. "Close it, Mark." But the key didn't fit anymore. The lock had changed, its shape twisting into something unrecognizable. I tried to force it, but the metal wouldn't budge. The creature loomed over us, its form growing more solid with every passing second. "You don't understand," it said, its tone almost gentle. "You were never meant to stop me. You were meant to bring me here." Harold Whittaker's journal flashed through my mind, the cryptic warnings, the desperate pleas. He hadn't been trying to contain the shadow. He'd been delaying this. And now, thanks to me, it was too late. "What are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible over the roar of the void. The creature tilted its head, as if considering the question. "I am what comes after," it said. "I am the hunger that devours the light. You call me shadow, but I am the source." Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "We have to run," she said, her voice breaking. But there was nowhere to go. The asylum was collapsing around us, the walls crumbling and the floor buckling as the void spread outward. The creature raised a long, spindly arm, and the key flew from my hand, drawn to it like a magnet. It studied the object for a moment before crushing it effortlessly between its fingers. The sound of the metal breaking was deafening. "Now," it said, turning its gaze to me, "you will see." The world dissolved. I was no longer in the asylum, or the town, or anywhere I recognized. I was standing in a vast, empty expanse, the sky a swirling mass of darkness and fire. Shapes moved in the distance, towering, grotesque forms that defied logic. They shifted and writhed, their movements unnatural, their proportions impossible. Emily was beside me, clutching my arm. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "What is this place?" she whispered. "The beginning," the creature said, stepping forward. "And the end." It raised its arms, and the shapes in the distance began to move closer. Their forms became clearer, massive, monstrous beings with limbs that stretched and bent in ways that made my stomach churn. They were coming for us. "This is what you've brought into your world," the creature said, its voice filled with satisfaction. "This is the truth you sought." I looked at Emily, tears streaming down her face, and felt a surge of desperation. This couldn't be how it ended. There had to be a way out. And then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible against the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Run," I said, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the light. The creature laughed, a sound that echoed endlessly, but it didn't follow. It didn't need to. The shapes were closing in, their massive bodies blotting out the light as they moved. But we kept running, the glimmer growing brighter with every step. It was the only hope we had. The key slid into the jagged lock with an almost eager precision. The moment it turned, a deep groan resonated through the walls, like the building itself was in agony. The door didn't open immediately. Instead, the symbols carved into its surface began to glow, pulsating with a sickly green light that made my skin crawl. Behind me, Emily's breathing quickened. "Mark, we don't have to do this." "We don't have a choice," I said, though my voice trembled with doubt. The whispers in my head were deafening now, urging me forward. The shadow wasn't just waiting, it was watching. With a sharp click, the lock gave way, and the door swung open. What lay beyond wasn't what I expected. It wasn't the swirling void I'd imagined, or even a room. Instead, it was familiar. A small, dimly lit attic, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. It was our attic, the same one we'd left behind when we fled the house. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "How is this possible?" I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room felt real, solid. But there was something wrong, something I couldn't quite place. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. And then I saw it, the journal, sitting on the same table where we'd first found it. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The pages were blank, save for one sentence scrawled in the center of the first page. "You were never meant to escape." The words seemed to ripple across the page, and suddenly, the shadows in the room began to shift. They stretched and twisted, pulling away from the corners and coalescing into a single, towering form. It wasn't the shadow I'd seen before. This one was more defined, more human. It looked like me. "Mark," Emily gasped, backing away. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, my face, was a grotesque mockery, its features stretched and distorted. "You brought me here," it said, its voice a warped echo of my own. "You opened the way." I stumbled backward, clutching the key. "What do you want?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "To take your place," it said simply. Before I could react, the shadow lunged. Its form enveloped me, cold and suffocating, as if I were being swallowed whole. I struggled, but it was like fighting water. My vision blurred, and I felt myself being pulled downward, sinking into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the asylum. But something was wrong. Emily stood in front of me, staring at the shadow, the thing that now wore my face. "Emily, it's me." I shouted, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped, my body unresponsive. I could only watch as she looked at the doppelganger, her face filled with terror and disbelief. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. The shadow smiled, my smile. "It's over," it said, reaching out to her. "We can finally go home." "No." I screamed, but the sound never reached her. She hesitated, her eyes flickering between the two of us, and then, she took its hand. As they walked away, the door to the asylum slammed shut, leaving me alone in the dark. The key was gone, and with it, my last chance of escape. I realized then what Harold Whittaker had meant. The shadow didn't want to destroy me, it wanted to replace me. To take my life, my identity, and leave me trapped here, in the void where it had once been imprisoned. And now, it had succeeded. Emily and the shadow returned to the house, where life seemed to go on as before. To her, there was no longer any difference between the man she loved and the thing that now wore his face. But every so often, late at night, she would hear faint whispers in the corners of the room. A voice, hoarse and desperate, calling her name. And somewhere, in a place beyond time and space, I screamed. Forever.